4 minutes, that's all it took. 4 minutes on live television to dismantle a narrative that took years, millions of followers, polished speeches, and clever headlines to build. J.D. Vance didn't come with camera tricks or talking points. He came with one question, just one. And when he asked it, in front of the cameras, the crowd, and the country, AOC froze. The room, once buzzing with applause, turned cold. She blinked. She looked down. And for the first time in her career, she had no answer. It wasn't noise that silenced her. It was truth, sharpened, surgical, and undeniable. The clip didn't just go viral. It carved a wound into the conversation about power, influence, and who we really trust. AOC walked in untouchable. She walked out undone. And as millions replayed those 4 minutes across screens and living rooms, one question echoed louder than any headline. Who are they really fighting for? The story you're about to hear is a work of dramatized imagination, but like all good stories, it's rooted in something real. The names are public, the words are crafted, but the emotions, the tension, the doubt, the quiet reckoning, they belong to all of us. In a world where politics is often theater, sometimes fiction becomes the clearest mirror of truth. Because sometimes, when the lights are brightest and the microphones are live, truth doesn't echo, it detonates. Stay with us. The next 4 minutes might change the way you see them. And yourself. Washington was loud, even at midnight. Outside the window of a modest third-floor apartment in the southeast corner of D.C., sirens murmured like restless ghosts, weaving through the glow of passing headlights. But inside, the room was still, almost reverent. No TV, no music, just the low hum of the old wall heater and the sound of fingers brushing across folded paper. J.D. Vance sat alone, hunched over the edge of a weathered oak desk that bore the dents and ink stains of speeches past. His jacket, pressed and ready for tomorrow's debate, hung silently over the back of his chair like a quiet witness. In his hand, he held a letter, creased, smudged, and written in the rigid block handwriting of a man who'd clearly been trained to write under pressure. Sir, I served 2 tours in Kandahar, came back to bills I couldn't pay and knees I can't afford to fix. They say I'm proud. I say I'm forgotten. I hope to God someone like you remembers us. Lance Corporal Derek Holloway, retired. J.D. read the letter again, for the 4th time, maybe 5th, but his hand still trembled like it was the first. He ran his thumb gently across the last line, as if trying to memorize the weight of the ink. There was a knock at the window, not outside, inside his head, a sound he hadn't heard in years. It was the memory of a clinking fork on ceramic, a rusted fan turning, and the familiar voice of his grandfather, low, tired, always watching C-SPAN while flipping through a yellowed copy of American Legion Monthly. Flashback, Middletown, Ohio. A dim kitchen, early 90s. Young J.D. sits on a wobbly chair, swinging his feet just above the cracked linoleum. His mother, face worn from a double shift at the nursing home, slides a can of beans onto the stove while muttering about a utility bill. Why do they always yell on TV? J.D. had asked once. His grandfather answered without looking up. 'Cause son, folks who have nothing left to say raise their voice. The ones who matter, they raise the stakes. It was the kind of line a child forgets until it comes back exactly when it's needed. Back in the present, J.D. folded the letter slowly and slid it into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. The movement was gentle, intentional, like tucking away something sacred. He whispered to the empty room, "Let this speak louder than me." His eyes flicked toward the wall across from him, where a pinboard of yellowing headlines and debate cue cards still hung. One headline read, AOC targets J.D., Vance on oil lobby, ties in upcoming debate. Below it, J.D. had written in Sharpie, "Don't take the bait, take the truth." His phone buzzed once. A reminder, Live Network debate, 9 a.m., studio call, time 6:30 a.m. He didn't silence it. He just stared. And then, like someone playing a chess move days in advance, J.D. reached into the drawer beneath the desk and pulled out a second copy of the letter, already sealed in a blank white envelope. Just in case. He looked out the window one last time. The city lights blinked back, impersonal and indifferent. Tomorrow he would walk into a room built for sound bites, traps, and flashbulbs. But he wasn't going in empty-handed. He was bringing Derek with him, and millions of others who'd never been invited to that room. Outside, the Capitol skyline shimmered in early morning haze, but inside the studio's private prep suite, room B302, the air was sharp with caffeine, cologne, and calculation. Just 2 floors below the main debate stage, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood in front of a mirror lined with soft bulbs, practicing a smile that wasn't too smug, a smirk that wasn't too soft. She raised one eyebrow, dropped it, then tried again, measuring not just her words but the angle of her jaw. Her team buzzed around her like hornets, tablets in hand, notes on sleeves, coffee cups being refilled without request. There was no laughter here, just rapid-fire talking points and sharp glances. A large screen on the wall played muted clips from JD's recent town halls. They'd studied him like a final exam. "He always flinches when you bring up corporate PACs," said Marla, her senior media strategist. "He tries to look noble, but the numbers don't lie. Just corner him with ClearLink. Pause. Let the audience do the rest." AOC nodded but didn't look up. She was mouthing something to herself, words rehearsed not for authenticity but for effect. Then came the quieter voice. Eli, her closest aide, the one who spoke when everyone else was performing. "Get him angry," Eli whispered, leaning close. "He's less likable when he's angry. You saw it in Iowa." She turned, expression unreadable, then asked, "Do we have the visual from the Ohio gas conference? The one with him shaking hands with that refinery executive?" "Already cued for post-show spin," Marla confirmed. "You just land the first punch. We'll handle the highlight reel." AOC took a breath, long and controlled. She didn't fear JD's intellect. He was sharp, yes, but so were most of the men she'd outmaneuvered. No, what unsettled her slightly was the tone he carried. Steady, unflashy, and irritatingly sincere. He never tried to win the room, and that made him harder to isolate. But she had the edge tonight. Her team had shaped the questions. The network wanted viral moments. And more importantly, the moderator had been briefed. Upstairs, producers were already tweaking timing cues to lean into tension. Policy was the excuse. Drama was the goal. AOC knew how to play to both. She stood up, adjusted the sleeve of her suit. Emerald green, camera-friendly, dominant but not too aggressive, and glanced briefly at the door. "Let's make a little noise," she said, half to herself. The hallway outside was quiet. A red light flickered at the end, signaling stage call in 10 minutes. But before stepping out, AOC paused. Her hand rested briefly on the back of the chair she'd been sitting in. Just a touch, nothing more. It was the smallest gesture, but perhaps in that stillness, there was something she wouldn't say aloud. A sliver of curiosity. A question not about what she would say, but about what he might bring. And she wasn't wrong to wonder, because just 1 floor above her, in a holding room that didn't even have a mirror, JD Vance had just buttoned his jacket, quietly tucking a folded letter into his breast pocket. The hallway was long, narrow, and strangely quiet, like a throat just before a scream. JD Vance walked slowly, his leather shoes clicking against the polished marble with a rhythm he didn't rush. In front of him, lining the left-hand wall, hung a series of black and white portraits. Past senators, decades of them. Frozen mid-thought, mid-speech, mid-war. Most of the names were forgotten now, but the faces watched. Some smiled, some didn't. One bore the faint burn mark of a cigarette. Maybe accidental, maybe not. JD paused at one frame. The brass plate beneath read, Senator Howard F. Baker, 1967 to 1985. Always speak last if you want to be remembered. JD gave a faint private nod as if to say message received, then kept walking. A stagehand's voice crackled softly in his earpiece. Final call. 90 seconds. JD didn't reply. He was already rolling his shoulders once, steadying his breath, right thumb brushing the inside lining of his jacket where Derek's folded letter now rested like a pulse. At the far end of the hallway, a side door clicked open. AOC stepped in, heels sharp, posture regal. She was flanked by a junior aide who peeled away immediately, leaving her alone. Her suit glowed faintly under the LED rim lights. Green, assertive, already ready for its camera close-up. For a moment, neither spoke. They walked toward each other, slow and straight. Two trains on parallel rails, moving toward a point they both knew couldn't be avoided. The portraits between them reflected both their faces in fractured glass. They made eye contact. Not a glare, not a smile, just an exchange. Cool, calculated, and wordless. JD's eyes were unreadable, and AOC's mouth tightened, ever so slightly, like someone who just remembered a rule she meant to break. Then, as if choreographed, they both turned into opposite corridors, heading toward the stage from different wings. Backstage, the hum of production came alive. A grip moved lights into place. The sound tech gave the moderator a last-minute battery swap. Someone cursed about the countdown timer being 2 seconds slow, and on a side monitor, the title graphic pulsed softly. America Decides Live Town Hall. Debate Vance versus Ocasio-Cortez. JD entered from stage right. He didn't wave. AOC appeared from stage left. She did, briefly. They took their places behind twin podiums, positioned 12 feet apart, though the cameras would make it feel closer. The moderator, blinking hard under the lights, cleared his throat, checked his teleprompter, then leaned forward to the mic. Red light. 3 seconds. 2, 1. Broadcast live, nationwide. Now and in that fleeting silence, just before words reclaimed the room, JD glanced once at AOC, not as an opponent, but as a mirror of everything the American conversation had become. Scripted, fragile, and one sharp truth away from collapse. He didn't come here for applause. He came to speak for someone who'd never been invited to that stage. And tonight, silence wouldn't save anyone. The lights were colder than expected. JD felt them settle on his shoulders, like armor being fastened. Heavy, necessary. The moderator's voice filled the studio with its usual artificial warmth, reciting a welcome script that neither guest needed to hear. Everyone in the room already knew why they were there. Across the stage, AOC smiled as the cameras panned to her, that practiced blend of poise and conviction. And when the moderator turned toward her with the opening prompt, "Congresswoman, you have the floor," she didn't hesitate. "Thank you. I want to begin tonight by talking about justice. Not just social justice, but environmental justice. Because for too long, the people paying the highest price for pollution and deregulation have been the ones with the least power to stop it." Her voice was measured, crisp, almost lyrical. JD recognized it immediately, the polished cadence of someone who had practiced in front of mirrors and microphones. But more than that, she knew her lines would go viral. That was the real objective, and she was good at it. We cannot talk about jobs without talking about air, about water, about survival. When we subsidize fossil fuels, we don't just invest in an industry, we disinvest in human health, in the lungs of our children. A small round of applause broke out from the live audience. AOC let it breathe for exactly 3 seconds before pivoting. Her tone didn't shift, but her eyes did. And speaking of disinvestment, I find it deeply troubling that my colleague, Senator Vance, has accepted over $900,000 in campaign donations from fossil fuel executives and PACs tied to the oil industry. JD didn't blink. Now, we all have choices to make. I chose to stand with science. He chose to stand with pipelines. And tonight, I think the American people deserve to know why. The cameras cut to JD, close up. The moderator's lips barely moved, but his voice came through. "Senator Vance, your response." There were no applause cues now, no movement in the audience. Just the live red light pulsing above the camera and JD Vance standing still, unshaken. "Thank you, and thank you, Congresswoman, for the opening monologue." He paused, not sarcastically, but with precision. The kind of pause that reclaims ground, not surrenders it. Let's begin with facts. Yes, I've accepted donations from energy sector contributors, and I've also written legislation that protects energy workers, retrains coal miners, and increases transparency in contracting. Those aren't headlines. They're votes, they're bills, and they're public. He turned briefly toward the moderator, then back to the audience. I grew up in a town where the factory closed, the steel plant collapsed, and the only thing left was the gas station and a stack of medical bills. We don't have the luxury of shouting at industries from rooftops while sipping lattes in Brooklyn. We're trying to keep the lights on in places where the zip code gets you ignored. There was a low murmur in the room. JD's tone hadn't changed. Still calm, still steady, but the weight behind it began to shift the atmosphere. He continued, eyes locked on the camera now. You want to talk about standing with science? Great. Let's also stand with the workers who built this country and not pretend that supporting clean energy means erasing their livelihood overnight. You don't fight injustice with hashtags. You fight it with honest work, clear numbers, and policy that respects reality. The moderator nodded slightly, perhaps impressed by the calm precision. Across the stage, AOC's lips were still curved in a composed smile, but her fingers drummed the side of her podium, a beat faster than before. The moment JD finished speaking, there was a stillness, brief but charged. Then AOC leaned forward slightly. Not enough to look aggressive, just enough to signal she wasn't done. The moderator glanced at the cue screen. His producer's voice buzzed in his earpiece. Let her swing. Let it breathe. She did. You know, Senator, AOC began, her voice like silk pulled tight. You always speak so eloquently about working-class families, forgotten towns, your grandfather, coal miners. It's a compelling narrative. She smiled just enough to show teeth. But when you strip away the stories, you vote for the same corporations that close those factories. You defend the same tax loopholes that let billionaires dodge the very system your grandfather paid into. And while you talk like a patriot, she turned slightly toward the audience. Let the pause hang. You vote like a profiteer. The line landed like a slap. A few audience members gasped. Then came the applause, not thunderous, but sharp, like it knew exactly what it was applauding. On Twitter, clips were already being trimmed. The phrase, vote like a profiteer, lit up trending columns before the moderator could even lean back toward his mic. The camera cut to JD. He didn't flinch, but his jaw tensed, just enough for anyone watching closely to notice. For a moment, he didn't speak. Instead, he looked down, toward his podium, then to the floor, not avoiding, just pausing. And in that pause, his thumb brushed gently against the inside pocket of his jacket. He could feel the edges of the folded paper, the weight of real handwriting, the rhythm of truth that wasn't crafted for applause. I served 2 tours in Kandahar. He didn't need to read the letter again. It was in him now. The moderator broke the moment. Senator Vance, would you like to respond? JD looked up, his face steady, voice measured, but softer now, more personal. I've been called a lot of things in my life. Profiteer is a new one. There was a smattering of laughter. Nervous, unsure which side it belonged to. I was raised by a woman who worked night shifts and slept through Christmas to keep the lights on. We didn't profit. We survived. And I don't tell that story to win sympathy. I tell it because it's not just mine. It's millions of others who don't get invited to this stage. AOC tilted her head slightly. JD continued. You're right about one thing. I do vote with a deep responsibility. Not to headlines, not to corporations, but to the people who don't get noticed unless we use their pain in a speech. He stopped, just for a beat. You're clever, Congresswoman. You know how to frame a moment. But patriotism isn't performance. It's not how loud you say you care. It's how long you're willing to stand when no one claps. The audience quieted. Even the moderator, now sensing the shift in tone, sat back a little deeper into his seat. In the control room, a producer whispered, "We've got something. Don't cut." Back on stage, JD didn't smile. He didn't gesture. He simply let the moment hang. And in that silence, the crack AOC had tried to open began to echo back. Not with outrage, with memory, with something real. There was a pause. Not a technical one. Not the kind producers fear. This pause had weight, like the air between 2 old friends when one says something he can't take back. JD glanced sideways at the moderator, then at AOC. Then, without breaking eye contact with the camera light, he stepped just slightly forward. Not enough to trigger a stage cue, but enough to reclaim space. His voice didn't rise. His expression didn't shift, but his eyes, steady and clear, looked into the lens like it wasn't a camera at all, like it was a window into every kitchen, garage, and living room in America, where someone still believed integrity could be quiet. My grandfather didn't fight in Korea, so his grandson could be told he's corrupt by a PR campaign. The words landed with a silence far heavier than applause. Across the country, in towns with names most politicians mispronounce, the line hit like a thud to the chest. In a recliner in Kentucky, an aging Marine leaned forward. In a VFW hall in Iowa, a bartender stopped pouring. In a VA hospital in Arizona, a nurse paused a wheelchair mid-hallway. JD continued, still speaking into the camera, not as a politician now, but as a man who hadn't forgotten where he came from. My grandfather worked a steel press for 41 years. He had calluses on his hands and a radio on the shelf playing the news every night. He didn't trust easy, but he knew the difference between a speech and a stand. He let that breathe, then went on. I know what this is. I know how it looks. AOC's team has a job to do. Frame me as bought, as broken, as another politician who traded stories for stock options. He nodded just once. But I didn't come here to look clean. I came here to stay honest. Now he turned just slightly, addressing the studio room. Not confrontational, but open. There's a difference between performance and conviction, and folks watching tonight can feel it. They've been feeling it their whole lives, in closed factories, in folded flags, in letters that don't get read on the Senate floor because they didn't come with a check attached. He placed a hand over his chest, where the letter rested. I brought someone with me tonight, not in person, in paper. A veteran who served 2 tours, came home broken, and asked one question in his letter. Do you remember us? The moderator shifted in his seat. AOC's face remained composed, but her eyes dropped briefly to her notes. Searching for something, maybe a pivot, maybe a defense that didn't sound like spin. JD returned his gaze to the camera. To him, and to everyone like him, I just want to say, I remember. And I'm not leaving this stage tonight without making sure someone else does too. The light above camera 1 blinked, signaling time was nearly up. But no one cut him off. No one dared. Because in that moment, he wasn't holding the line for himself anymore. He was holding it for people who never got invited to speak in rooms like this, but still paid the price when others did. The moderator shifted in his seat. The tension in the studio had grown quiet. Not comfortable, not resolved, but coiled, as if everyone was waiting for someone to say something dangerous. JD didn't rush. He didn't flinch. He just stood there for a moment longer, letting the silence live. Then, without looking at the moderator or glancing toward the audience, he reached calmly into the inside pocket of his jacket. His fingers found the letter, resting quietly over his heart. But he didn't pull that out yet. Instead, he moved to the opposite side, beneath the lapel, and withdrew a single folded sheet of printer paper, the kind that looked utterly plain, until you realized it had weight. JD unfolded it once, methodically, and laid it gently on the edge of the podium. The camera zoomed slightly instinctively. Producers in the control room leaned forward. The moderator blinked, hesitated, unsure whether to interrupt. JD didn't speak right away. He let the paper rest there, like a card face down in a game no one else realized had started. Then softly but clearly, Congresswoman, I believe in transparency. You've asked where my money comes from. That's fair. But let's talk about yours. He tapped the sheet once with his index finger. This is an email, dated August 14th, sent from your campaign's Deputy Finance Director to ClearLink Global, a data firm currently under federal investigation for unauthorized biometric harvesting in Afghanistan. There was a slight rustle in the audience. One person audibly gasped. The moderator opened his mouth, closed it again. JD continued, voice low but steady. In this email, your staff not only thanks ClearLink for their past support, but includes new bundled donation forms, suggesting a direct pipeline between their executive board and your digital advertising strategy. He looked up, straight at AOC now. Is this the justice you claim to stand for? It wasn't a shout. It was worse. It was a challenge that didn't ask to be answered. It demanded to be reconciled. The room froze. AOC's composure didn't crack. Not fully, but her expression flickered. A tightening of the jaw, a brief glance down at her own podium, as if something might be written there that could undo what had just been said. JD didn't blink. Because I've met soldiers who had their fingerprints, iris scans, and even DNA collected in war zones, without knowledge, without consent, only to learn later those records were sold, repackaged, and funneled through firms like Clearlink. He paused. No dramatics, just truth. And now those same firms fund your next commercial. The moderator finally leaned forward, voice cautious. Senator Vance, we haven't independently verified this email. JD turned toward him. Not aggressive, simply clear. The email is public. It was leaked 2 days ago, confirmed by at least 2 independent journalists. Your own network received a copy this morning. The moderator fell silent. JD tapped the email again, then folded it neatly and placed it back into his jacket. He didn't follow it up with a dramatic statement. He didn't look at the crowd for validation. He simply stood still. And that, more than anything, made the moment land like a dropped anchor in shallow water. Across the country, screens flickered. Viewers leaned in. Who really funds the outrage? One viewer typed. Did she know? Another asked. She froze, someone else posted. Replay it, she froze. And she had, for just 1 second. But in political theater, a second is eternity. The room hadn't moved. Even the studio lights seemed to dim. Or maybe that was just the tension in the air, tightening like an invisible belt around the neck of the show. JD stood silent after placing the folded email back in his jacket. He didn't follow it with a tagline or a look to the audience. He simply let the question linger. Is this the justice you claim to stand for? AOC hadn't answered. Not yet. Her hand hovered just above her notes, fingers resting gently on the edge of her podium, as if bracing for recoil. The moderator cleared his throat. It was a small sound, but in that stillness, it roared. Thank you, Senator Vance, he said, voice clipped, eager to reclaim pace. Let's move now to the next question. Energy subsidies and inflation relief. Congresswoman, we'll begin with... No, JD said calmly. Let's not move on just yet. There was no malice in his voice, but there was iron. And for the first time all night, it wasn't the audience or AOC who blinked first. It was the moderator. JD turned slightly toward him, not confrontational, but unyielding. You gave her 3 uninterrupted minutes to question my ethics. I think it's only fair the American people get to hear the words her campaign actually used. Unfiltered, unspun. The moderator hesitated. Someone in his earpiece spoke urgently. He looked down, touched his earpiece, then back at JD. JD continued anyway. He reached into his jacket again. This time the audience murmured. They knew what was coming. He unfolded the email with the precision of someone handling evidence in court. August 14th, 9:06 a.m., JD read aloud. Subject line, follow-up on bundle, urgent. From Paige Mercer, Deputy Finance Director, Friends of Alexandria. He didn't rush. Thank you again for your support at the June event. As discussed, we are including links for your preferred donor bundle, as well as early access to our voter data pilot program. Your partnership in this cycle is more vital than ever as we expand our digital footprint internationally. A faint gasp echoed off the studio walls. Internationally? One viewer whispered at home. Voter data pilot program? Another typed in the comment stream. She's giving them access? A retired veteran posted from Michigan. AOC raised her hand lightly, trying to interject without looking frantic. That's not the full context. JD looked up. Calm, quiet, devastating. Then please provide it. Her mouth opened, closed. She blinked once sharply. Her voice was there, but the phrasing hadn't arrived yet. And in live television, that delay was a wound. That message, she started, was part of a larger, exploratory outreach for voter engagement strategies. Clearlink was a consultant, not a core partner. Her words were clean. Her tone was steady. But for the first time, they weren't landing. Because in the space between each sentence was the thing she hadn't said. And JD didn't press further. He didn't need to. He folded the paper again, slower this time, and slipped it back into his pocket. Then looking not at AOC, not at the moderator, but into the camera, he spoke one sentence. You can call it strategy, but the rest of the country calls it something else. He didn't define it. He didn't have to. Behind the scenes, the moderator rubbed his temple. His earpiece buzzed again. Shift topics. Reset tone. Before this turns. But it already had. The audience wasn't clapping. They weren't cheering. They were watching. And when a room full of people goes quiet but doesn't look away, that's not boredom. That's judgment. The paper was folded. The moment was not. JD stood motionless behind the podium, hand resting gently on the edge like he was anchoring himself in something deeper than politics. The moderator didn't speak. AOC didn't interrupt. The room held its breath, waiting for someone, anyone, to break the silence. But it was JD who owned it. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't look to the audience. Instead, he turned once more to the camera, as if it were an old friend or a jury. Then he spoke, quiet but unmistakable. I don't yield to the rude, especially not to those who trade countrymen for campaign checks. He didn't blink, didn't smile, didn't soften the blow. He let it hang, like smoke in a room that had forgotten to breathe. No applause followed, no gasps, just a stillness so thick it sounded louder than sound. The type of stillness that told you something had cracked, not theatrically, but fundamentally. In living rooms across the country, something in viewers shifted. Not all agreed, but all felt it, because what JD had just said wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't built for virality, and that's exactly why it went viral. AOC's eyes didn't leave her notes, but her knuckles, subtly, had turned white on the rim of her podium. The moderator shifted, trying to locate the next question card in front of him. His hands moved, but his voice didn't come. JD continued, but not to twist the knife, to finish the sentence that started long before tonight. There are lines you don't cross, not because they're political, but because they're moral. When a soldier writes me about his trauma being monetized, when a working mother tells me her data was sold while she applied for food stamps, I don't shrug. I listen. His voice remained calm, almost weary. And when someone cashes those realities into campaign fuel, wraps it in marketing, and calls it justice, I call that what it is. He paused. A betrayal. Still, the room didn't clap. It didn't need to, because what JD was saying wasn't designed to entertain. It wasn't built to trend. It was something far more dangerous. It was built to last. In the control booth, a producer whispered, "Cut to wide. Let the moment breathe." The camera pulled back slowly, capturing JD alone at the podium, upright, composed, and unshaken, while AOC stood still, caught not in defeat, but in calculation. What could she say now? That wouldn't sound like cleanup. The moderator finally found his voice, soft and cautious. "Congresswoman, your rebuttal?" AOC looked up. For the first time that night, she didn't speak immediately. She reached for her water, took a sip, then placed it back down with care. But before she could respond, the light on camera one blinked again. Not because time was up, but because the moment was. JD had just shifted the tone of the debate, not with fury, but with clarity. And the silence that followed, that was agreement. The question had already been asked. But it wasn't the moderator's. And it wasn't one that could be dodged by pivoting to policy or leaning into applause lines. It came from a folded sheet of paper, from the voice of a veteran who had no mic, and from a man who, for 4 minutes, had stood not as a candidate, but as a mirror. Now it was AOC's turn to speak. The red light blinked atop camera 2. The moderator gave her a gentle nod. Not one of encouragement, but of duty. Time to respond. Time to perform. She opened her mouth, closed it. Her eyes flicked down to the notes laid neatly before her, color-coded, annotated, designed for every scenario. Except this one. She scanned the ink like it might rewrite itself. It didn't. "What I think we're seeing here," she began, voice slightly thinner than usual, "is a very calculated distortion of campaign communication. And I stand by my team's outreach efforts as legal, ethical, she paused, swallowed, and in line with broader engagement strategies to empower voters. It was the kind of sentence that said nothing, but usually said it well. This time it barely stood on its feet. A few murmurs scattered across the audience. Not jeers, not laughs, just noise, uncertainty, the kind that drifts into a room when confidence wavers. She looked at the moderator, subtly, almost pleading. It wasn't overt, but it was there. A glance that said, "Help me steer this back." The moderator's lips parted, a cue prepared. But before he could intervene, JD raised the folded email again. He didn't wave it, he didn't speak. He just held it there, casually, confidently, like a truth too solid to burn. The effect was immediate. AOC's gaze returned to him, not in defiance, but in calculation. She was searching for his weakness, for a crack. But all she found was stillness, and that stillness was louder than anything she could say. Backstage, behind the dark scrim of curtain and camera gear, a young producer mouthed a question toward the control room. "Cut?" The director didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the screen, watching the moment unfold like a slow implosion. The kind that doesn't crumble the building, just the illusion of who built it. AOC tried again. "I think it's dangerous, very dangerous, when we cherry-pick communication and pretend that fundraising is somehow an attack on character." But the words fell flat, because the audience didn't see cherry-picking. They saw a name, a timestamp, a direct quote, and worse, they saw no answer. JD didn't move. He didn't need to. His silence now had edges, not soft, not passive. It cut cleaner than interruption ever could. The moderator finally spoke, but his voice came out half-measured. "Congresswoman, would you like to—" "No," AOC said too quickly. "I've said what I needed to." That was the moment. Not a collapse, not an explosion, just 4 words. "I've said what I needed to." That felt like retreat dressed up as resolution. And somewhere in that strange space between power and panic, the story began writing itself. Not with shouting, not with scandal, but with silence. And the face of a woman who had always known how to finish strong, now blinking under lights that felt a shade too bright. The red light dimmed. The instant it did, the studio cracked open like a soda can, shaken too long. Stage hands stepped in from the wings, one of them already unplugging a floor mic. The moderator exhaled loudly, too loudly, and began flipping through his cue cards, no longer pretending the situation was under control. But AOC didn't wait for instructions. She stepped back from the podium with clipped, surgical grace and turned sharply toward the stage exit. Her heels echoed like punctuation marks across the floor, rapid and deliberate. One of her aides, Eli, rushed after her, headset still dangling, iPad forgotten on the moderator's desk. "Alex, wait!" he tried, but she didn't. A curtain swung open as she passed. It snapped back closed behind her, like a wound being stitched too late. No words, no handshake, no eye contact. Meanwhile, JD remained at his podium. He didn't follow, didn't react, didn't even glance toward the commotion behind him. He simply reached for the glass of water on the edge of the desk, lifted it with one hand, and took a slow sip. The room swirled around him. Crew voices, lighting resets, production chatter. But in that chaos, he was still. A studio tech passed behind him, coiling wires. He paused, looked at JD for a second too long, then gave a single, silent nod. JD returned it with a small lift of the glass. That was all. In the control room, multiple screens showed the same moment from different angles. JD standing still. AOC walking out. A folded sheet of paper still visible in his jacket pocket. A producer tapped her earpiece and muttered, "We just handed them the internet." And they had. Because even before the commercial's upbeat jingle had faded, the first wave had hit. Breaking. JD Vance shocks AOC with leaked email. Debate erupts live on air. She froze trends on X after viral clip shows AOC unable to answer funding question. Unedited clip hits 1.2 million views in 14 minutes. No caption needed. In a living room in Indiana, a retired Army medic called his son over. "That guy, JD, he's the real thing. You see how still he stood? That's how we're taught to wait before pulling a trigger." In a university dorm in Georgia, a political science major texted her group chat, "AOC got outplayed. This is going to be a case study." And in a newsroom in New York, a headline editor leaned back and whispered, "We're rewriting page 1. Back on set, the moderator returned to his seat, running a hand through his thinning hair. He looked at JD as if to say something. A thank you, maybe an apology. But JD had already unbuttoned his jacket, placed his microphone on the table, and was checking his watch. He stood, not urgently, not triumphantly, just finished. And as he stepped off stage, he didn't look back. He didn't need to, because whatever had just happened, whatever had collapsed in those 4 minutes, wasn't going to be fixed by sound bites or spin. Not now. It was just past 9:30 p.m. in a small town outside Dayton, Ohio, when Caleb Wexler finally pressed pause. The debate had ended 10 minutes earlier, but he hadn't been able to stop rewinding the clip. Back 10 seconds. Play, pause, back again. This time not to analyze the words, but to study the silence that followed them. He sat alone on the worn couch in his mother's living room, one hand gripping the TV remote, the other resting on his thigh, like he was bracing for something that had already happened. On the coffee table in front of him sat a folded American flag, the kind pressed into hands at funerals. Behind it, in a simple black frame, was the last photo ever taken of his father. Staff Sergeant Brian Wexler, U.S. Army, KIA 2010. For years, Caleb had watched politicians throw around words like sacrifice, duty, and honor, usually with voices that rose too fast and faces that turned toward cameras before finishing their thoughts. But this time had been different. JD hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't performed. He had remembered. And Caleb felt it, like someone had finally read his father's name out loud in a room that wasn't built to listen. He grabbed his phone, opened his messages, typed, "That was for my dad." Then after a second, finally. He didn't send it to a politician. He didn't tag the network. He sent it to his best friend Mason, who'd also lost his father in Iraq. Mason replied instantly, "Same here." That hit different. On instinct, Caleb opened X. The clip was everywhere, but it wasn't the hashtags from JD's campaign that caught his eye. It was a new one. Hashtag #IsStandWithJD. And it wasn't just trending, it was surging. There were posts from veterans' spouses, from truckers, from librarians, from students. Videos of people watching the moment in silence. Screenshots of AOC's frozen expression beside JD's calm stance. And one comment thread that simply read, "I didn't expect to cry during a debate." It wasn't the debate, it was the truth. Caleb stared at the screen, thumb hovering. Then he clicked retweet, typed a short caption. He said what no one ever did. For my dad. For all of them. Then he closed the app. Not because he was done, but because he didn't need validation. He stood up, walked over to the framed photo, and adjusted it slightly on the shelf. A soft knock came from the kitchen door. His mom leaned in, holding 2 mugs. "I saw it," she said, eyes full but steady. "He said it plain, didn't he?" Caleb nodded. "Yeah, he really did." She handed him a mug, sat beside him, no more words needed. And while thousands debated policies and motives on glowing screens, in this quiet room in Ohio, a son felt seen. Not just as a voter, but as a name written in the margins of a folded letter, finally heard out loud. By sunrise, the headlines were already multiplying, faster than press teams could keep up. In a D.C. townhouse just blocks from Capitol Hill, the lights in AOC's campaign headquarters hadn't gone off all night. Inside, the walls were plastered with whiteboards and strategy printouts, now covered in fresh notes written in red Sharpie. Phones buzzed, laptops blinked. Staffers moved like a triage unit, fast, exhausted, and under orders. The directive was simple: contain it. "Clip it short," Marla said, staring at the footage. "We cut before he holds the paper. Just get her opening statement. Push that out in the next 15 minutes. "But the full version is everywhere," another aide responded. Then drown it. They pulled quotes from JD's past, an offhand line about corporate partnerships during a 2022 tech summit. Someone found a photo of him shaking hands with a refinery board member in Texas. A low-res image, but it would do. Within hours, posts flooded the timeline. JD Vance talks patriotism while backing billionaire donors. Vance dodges questions on past fossil fuel ties. Is he really for the working class? Fact check. JD Vance and the selective email scandal. Even a video resurfaced of JD from 5 years ago, making a joke about campaign money being the legal way to bribe a politician. It was clear satire, but stripped of context, it served its purpose. Give them noise, Marla said. If they're confused, they stop caring. Across town in the still quiet office of JD Vance, no press releases had been written. No damage control war room was buzzing. No email threads circulated with suggested talking points. Because JD wasn't talking. Not to reporters, not to cable news hosts, not even to staff asking if they should prep for a follow-up interview. He sat alone at his desk, jacket draped over the chair, sleeves rolled. In front of him sat a single laptop, open but untouched. The only thing moving was the slow curl of steam from a black coffee he hadn't touched. His aide, Marcus, appeared at the door. You sure you don't want to say something? Even a tweet? JD shook his head once. Let the moment breathe. Marcus hesitated. They're gonna twist it. JD looked up, calm. Then they'll twist it into something people want to untangle. He gestured toward the window, where the first rays of morning light crept across the Potomac. We didn't win the room. We won the pause. And outside, beyond campaign doors and briefing calls, America was doing exactly what JD had predicted. It was listening. Because for every headline meant to discredit, there were screenshots. For every meme attacking, there was a reply thread defending. And for every attempted distraction, there was a single clip being replayed again and again. JD's voice, quiet, firm, holding the email like a verdict. One user wrote, I don't even agree with him on everything. But he didn't dodge, and that counts for something. Another, she walked out. He stood still. That's the debate. And under all of it, one hashtag refused to go away. Hashtag I stand with JD. It didn't come from consultants. It didn't come from media teams. It came from people. And that, more than any poll, told them something had shifted. Not in the race, but in the room between politics and the people watching. It started with a banner in a forgotten steel town near the Ohio River. Strung across the crumbling bricks of an old Union Hall, someone had printed JD's words in bold, blocky letters. I don't yield to the rude, especially not to those who trade countrymen for campaign checks. No logo, no party line, just the quote, framed by 2 small American flags painted by hand. By that evening, there were photos of coal trucks in West Virginia with the same line spray-painted across the side panels. Then came the veterans groups, posting it on Facebook above images of folded flags and empty boots. At first it looked like a ripple, then it became something else. Fox News ran it as a headline. The moment JD Vance stood for the silenced. Tucker Carlson ran a full segment titled, Finally, a Republican who doesn't apologize for patriotism. But on MSNBC, the tone split. One commentator said JD's quote was, calculated theater, emotional manipulation for the Rust Belt vote. Another warned it was the start of a populist wave draped in veteran sentiment. And on The View, co-hosts argued, loudly. It was powerful, said one. It was performative, said another. You don't walk out of a debate if you're winning, the third replied. Meanwhile, JD said nothing. In his Senate office, staff were overwhelmed. Over 2,000 letters had arrived in just 3 days. Dozens from veterans. Dozens more from factory workers who hadn't voted in a decade. Some came from teachers. Even a former protester in Oregon wrote, We don't agree on policy, but I saw conviction in your face. That's rare. But it was a letter postmarked from Kenosha, Wisconsin that JD read twice. It came from a high school civics teacher named Lena Hargrove, handwritten in blue ink on lined paper. There were faint coffee stains in the margins. It read, Dear Senator Vance, today I played that clip for my senior civics class. I didn't tell them who you were, just asked them to listen. When it ended, one student, who never speaks, raised his hand and said, "That man didn't blink. I don't know what you plan to do next, but please know this. My students saw integrity before they saw a party. That matters more than you know." Mrs. Hargrove, Kenosha High. JD folded the letter carefully and slid it into the same pocket where the veteran's letter still rested. 2 pieces of paper. 2 voices that somehow carried more than any news cycle. By the week's end, the quote had outgrown the man. It was on his shirts at a truck stop in Kansas. It showed up in the front window of a diner in Appalachia. It even appeared as a chalk drawing outside a VA clinic in Texas, where someone had written beneath it, "We don't need perfect, we need honest." For some, it was about the message. For others, it was the defiance. And for a growing few, it was about being seen finally as more than forgotten votes. But in the quiet corners of the Capitol, JD wasn't planning a campaign. He wasn't chasing the noise. He sat at his desk that Friday evening, reading Mrs. Hargrove's letter once more. The cameras were off, the lights were dim, and yet something bigger than ratings or polls had started moving. Not loud, not flashy, just steady. And this time, it didn't need microphones to be heard. Friday turned into Saturday with no fanfare. The Capitol was quieter on weekends. Fewer voices in the hallways. Fewer steps echoing down the marbled corridors. But inside J.D. Vance's office, there was movement. Slow, deliberate, personal. He stood at the far wall, a simple wooden frame in one hand, and the letter from Mrs. Hargrove in the other. He'd read it 6 times now. It still hit the same nerve. They wanted a spectacle. You gave us a spine. That one line had stuck with him, not because it praised him, but because it didn't talk about him at all. It talked about them, the students, the ones who weren't on Twitter, the ones who weren't polling or fundraising or spinning sound bites. The kids. JD gently placed the letter behind the glass. The frame wasn't flashy, just something he'd picked up that morning from a corner shop near Union Station. It had scuff marks along the edges. That felt right. He didn't hang it near his desk. He didn't put it near the awards, the committee photos, or the map of Appalachia he kept pinned with thumbtacks. Instead, he chose the wall near the door. The one every visitor passed on their way in and out. Because it wasn't for him. It was for the high school groups that came to the Capitol every spring. For the sons of coal miners and the daughters of veterans. For the students who didn't speak often but noticed everything. For the quiet ones who raised their hands only when something truly mattered. As he stepped back and looked at the frame, sunlight slipped through the blinds and cast soft light across the glass. For a second, the letter shimmered. There were no microphones, no red lights blinking. Just one man in a room, choosing what legacy looked like. A knock came at the door. One of his aides, young, sharp, still shaken by how quickly the public reaction had gone nuclear. "Sir," she said, peeking in, "they're asking if you'll respond to AOC's press conference Monday." JD glanced once more at the letter. He smiled. "I already did." On social media, the storm was still raging. On Sunday morning shows, pundits kept dissecting tone, timing, strategy. Some called him a rising threat. Others said he'd peaked. Some warned of radical populism. Others praised his courage. But JD didn't turn the TV on that weekend. He turned the page. He sat down at his desk and began handwriting a letter of his own. It was addressed to Kenosha, Wisconsin. It began simply, "Dear Mrs. Hargrove, you said your students saw a spine. I just hope they use theirs." The following Tuesday, a civics class from Virginia visited his office. As they filed in, laughing and nudging one another about who would run for office someday, one girl slowed at the doorway. She read the framed letter, twice. Then she looked back at JD sitting behind his desk and smiled. The kind of quiet, knowing smile that needed no words. The clip had been played on cable news 17 times in 24 hours. Pundits kept dissecting JD's tone, his pause before delivering the now viral line, the flicker on AOC's face when he held up the email like it was an indictment. By Monday, she was in a different kind of spotlight. No crowd, no applause, just a stool, a mic, and a high-backed chair opposite a journalist known more for surgical precision than sympathetic edits. The network billed it as a conversation, not a confrontation. But within 5 minutes, it was clear. This was an autopsy. AOC looked tired, not disheveled, never that, but her usual electric presence felt dimmed. Her suit was immaculate, her lines memorized, but the fire wasn't there. Something about the last 72 hours had drained her. "I stand by my values," she said, voice steady. "We all make mistakes under pressure." The host raised an eyebrow. Was it pressure or strategy? That question landed sharper than it sounded. There was a pause, the kind that makes producers sweat in the control room. AOC exhaled. "I believed I was right to challenge Mr. Vance's affiliations, but the email, that was presented without full context. It lacked clarity," the host finished, too politely. "No, nuance," she corrected, leaning forward. "Fundraising in a national campaign involves hundreds of touch points. The suggestion that I personally solicited funds from a company with data violations overseas is a mischaracterization." The host didn't nod, just flipped to the next card. "Were you aware of ClearLink's violations at the time of the email?" AOC hesitated. She blinked once. "I wasn't personally briefed." Outside the studio, the comment hit the wires within minutes. Inside swing districts in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Arizona, where military families watch carefully, the line played on repeat. "I wasn't personally briefed." By the next commercial break, her poll numbers had dropped 3 points. By nightfall, 5. In JD's camp, there was no gloating, no press tour, no self-congratulations. He remained silent, even as conservative talk shows lit up the airwaves with phrases like Vance victory and AOC collapse. But for her, the fallout wasn't political anymore. It was personal. Back in the green room, after the taping ended, AOC sat quietly. Her aide brought her water, but she didn't touch it. On her lap sat a note from a longtime donor, one who had maxed out her campaign contributions in the last 2 cycles. The note was short. "We believed in your fight, not your shortcuts." She folded it and didn't say a word. The silence around her was no longer tactical. It was heavy. It lingered. As the aide gathered her things, he asked gently, "Do you want to respond to JD's quote? Say something? Frame your side?" AOC stared ahead, then shook her head. In Capitol elevators, people no longer made eye contact. In district town halls, her name now drew scattered applause, or worse, uneasy quiet. The kind that suggested people were no longer angry, just unconvinced. She tried to anchor herself in past wins. The Green New Deal, the viral takedowns, the voice of a generation. But somehow in 4 minutes, all of that had dimmed beneath one email and one sentence. "I don't yield to the rude, especially not to those who trade countrymen for campaign checks." That line now appeared on bumper stickers, on t-shirts, and in swing state yard signs, many in neighborhoods that once knocked doors for her. The headlines roared louder than JD did. News anchors framed it as a takedown. Commentators called it political evisceration in under 4 minutes. Conservative influencers clipped the monologue and looped it under dramatic music. But inside JD Vance's modest Senate office, there were no fist bumps, no champagne, no "we did it." There was just the hum of fluorescent lights and the steady click of staffers refreshing their screens. The victory felt brittle, and no one in the room dared breathe like they'd won something permanent. An aide, younger than most, maybe 26, leaned back from her laptop, rubbed her temple, and broke the silence. "Sir, did we go too far?" The question landed softly, but it shifted the energy of the room like a glass tipping on the edge of a table. JD didn't look up from the printouts in front of him. The transcripts, the polling data, the comments flooding in from both supporters and critics. For a few seconds, he simply sat with the question, letting it echo. Then, without lifting his eyes, he spoke. Calmly, evenly. "The truth can't be too far." The room held still. Another aide, older, nodded. "It just feels like this moment could split the country further, or burn her down more than needed." JD finally looked up. His gaze wasn't angry. It was worn, focused. "If you knew what I read last night," he said, his voice lower now, "you'd worry less about her and more about who's been ignored." He reached into his jacket, still the same one from the debate, and pulled out the folded letter from the veteran. the one he had carried with him under the stage lights. He set it on the table like it carried weight beyond paper. A moment passed before he added, "I didn't bring that email to win. I brought it so that man's silence wouldn't be the only thing heard." Someone in the back, who had been quietly organizing call sheets, paused. Even the printer seemed to go quiet for a second longer than usual. Outside, the sound of traffic buzzed through the windows, but inside there was only clarity. JD stood and walked to the whiteboard they used to track votes and committees. He erased a few lines and wrote in black marker, "Don't mistake noise for justice." He tapped the quote once, then turned back to the team. "They're going to come hard. They'll say it was a personal attack, that I spun it, that I planned it all for headlines." His voice dropped a note lower. "Let them." He motioned to the email, still printed, still sharp with implication. "That's real. And if our politics can't hold space for uncomfortable truths, then we're not doing public service. We're doing public theater." No one replied. They didn't need to. Each staffer, in their own way, understood this wasn't about a viral clip. This was about a line JD had refused to cross until someone else crossed it first. That night, JD didn't appear on television. He declined an invitation from Tucker Carlson, turned down a sit-down with CNN, ignored a request for an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. Instead, he handwrote a thank you note to the civics teacher who had sent him the letter that now hung in a frame. One sentence in that note stood out: "We didn't win. We just reminded them we're still here." 3 days after the interview storm and the digital inferno it sparked, J.D. Vance boarded a black Ford pickup and drove 3 hours south of Charleston, West Virginia. No press crew followed. No speechwriters came along. Only one local stringer, a freelance journalist with a Canon camera and a notepad, had heard a whisper about the visit and showed up to see if it was real. The town wasn't even on most state maps anymore. One post office, one diner, a shuttered steelworks, and a handful of homes huddled under the gray Appalachian sky. J.D. stepped out of the truck without security, no staff. Just him, holding a folded paper with handwritten directions on it. No GPS had the road mapped right. The cold bit through his coat as he walked across a gravel lot to a rusted community center where 50 folding chairs had been set out, maybe 20 filled. At the front stood a man in his early 70s, shoulders hunched from decades underground, hands like tree roots. His name was Harold Wynn. He wore a faded Union jacket and a coal-dusted cap from a mine that hadn't operated since 2009. Harold reached out to shake JD's hand, his grip strong despite the arthritis that curled his knuckles. "You showed up," Harold said, looking him square in the eye. "Wasn't sure you would." JD gave a small nod, voice steady. "You've shown up every election. Figured it was my turn." Harold half smiled. "Most of them talk real nice until the cameras cut. Then we go back to being ghosts." Behind them, the freelance journalist adjusted her lens quietly, catching the moment in stills. Unposed, unscripted. There was no lighting crew, no backdrops, no media badge. Just two men in a quiet town sharing an honesty most politicians pay consultants to simulate. JD cleared his throat. "I didn't come here to make promises. I came to listen." And so he did. For the next hour, Harold told him about his grandson's struggles, getting medical care for black lung disease, about the local school closing because no teachers would stay, about how his wife cried last Thanksgiving when the power went out, and no one from the state answered the phones. At one point, Harold tapped JD's chest lightly, right where the veteran's letter still sat in that inside pocket. "They think we're expendable," he said, "but you reminded them we vote. Don't waste that." The words hit harder than any debate applause. They weren't meant for effect. They were meant for memory. When the short visit ended, the two men shook hands again. JD turned to leave, but not before Harold called out one last time, "You make noise in Washington, son. Not for yourself. For the ones that can't shout loud enough to be heard." The freelance journalist later uploaded her footage, just a few minutes long, titled "No Makeup, No Stage, Just History." Within 24 hours, it had over 2 million views, and in the comments below, one stood out, written by a woman from Pennsylvania. "This wasn't politics. This was what we forgot it could look like." It was a Tuesday morning, the kind where the gray skies outside felt like a blanket over Middletown High School. The heater in room 203 hummed softly, fighting off the late winter chill. Inside, 22 11th graders sat in worn desks arranged in a loose semicircle, their eyes fixed not on a whiteboard, but on the flickering screen at the front of the room. Mr. Clarkson, a tall civics teacher with a wool sweater and thinning hair, had paused their regular lesson on the Constitution. Instead, he dimmed the lights and pulled up a clip that had gone viral the week before. A grainy 3-minute segment from a political debate, stripped of logos and commentary, played through the classroom speakers. There was J.D. Vance, standing alone, a single page in his hand, speaking with quiet fury. "I don't yield to the rude," he said, "especially not to those who trade countrymen for campaign checks." On screen, AOC's face remained frozen. The moderator blinked. The room fell into stunned stillness. And then, the clip ended. No applause, no exit music, just silence. The classroom stayed quiet too, even after the screen went black, until a hand lifted from the middle row. It belonged to Max, a usually reserved student who wore his father's old dog tags under his hoodie. "Why did nobody clap?" Max asked, his voice honest, not sarcastic. Mr. Clarkson walked slowly to the front of the room, letting the question breathe before answering. "Because sometimes," he said softly, "the truth doesn't need applause. It just needs to be heard." The students looked around at each other. No one laughed. No one reached for their phones. In a room where reactions usually came fast and loud, something different had landed. Something heavier. Another student chimed in. "Was that email real?" "The one he read?" Mr. Clarkson nodded. "Verified by 3 outlets. They tried to spin it, but it stuck." The class sank into a thoughtful hush. Even the heater seemed quieter now. After a moment, Mr. Clarkson walked to the bulletin board and pinned up a printed screenshot of JD's final quote. Not in fancy font, not framed, just black ink on plain paper. He looked at the class again. "I don't care if you agree with him or not. That's your right. What I care about is whether you recognize what just happened there. A man told the truth, knowing it might cost him, and a room full of people who usually clap for sound bites went silent instead." He paused. "That's silence? That's integrity landing." In the back, a girl named Layla whispered, "Feels louder than cheering." Clarkson smiled faintly. "Exactly." The bell rang, shrill and sudden, but no one leapt from their seats. They moved slowly, some still glancing at the quote on the board. Max lingered behind as the others filed out. "My dad served," he said quietly to Clarkson. "He would have liked that guy." Clarkson nodded, placing a hand briefly on Max's shoulder. "He'd be proud of what you just saw." As the door clicked shut behind the last student, the civics teacher stood alone in the empty classroom. He looked once more at the quote, still tacked unevenly to the board, and then back to the blank screen. Some lessons he knew didn't need grading. The podcast studio wasn't much, just a converted attic above a bookshop in Charleston. There were no flashing lights, no live feeds, just a single microphone suspended above a wooden desk. The soundproofing was uneven, and the host had a cough he couldn't shake. But the download numbers told another story. Tens of thousands of listeners tuned in weekly, not for spectacle, but for substance. JD sat across from the host, sleeves rolled to his elbows, the same jacket folded neatly beside him. It still carried the faint creases from the night of the debate. The host clicked record, cleared his throat, and skipped the small talk. "Let me ask you plainly, Senator," he said, voice even. "Did you plan to end her career that night?" JD didn't flinch. He looked down at his hands for a moment, rougher than people expected from a senator, and then back up. "No," he said, "but I meant to protect mine and the people it serves." There was a pause, the kind that invites more. "I didn't walk onto that stage to humiliate anyone," he continued, his tone measured. "I walked on with a letter in my pocket, from a man who gave this country everything and still had to fight for scraps when he came home. I walked on carrying every handshake I'd had with a miner who asked me if anyone still remembered his town. I walked on not with rage but responsibility." The host leaned forward. "And when she accused you?" JD shook his head slowly. "She didn't accuse me. She dismissed the people I came there to speak for. That's different. That's personal. That's dangerous. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small folded card. Most people think the moment was that line. You know, I don't yield to the rude. But the moment for me was pinning this letter inside my coat the night before, reminding myself that the truth doesn't shout, it just stands its ground. He didn't read the letter aloud. He didn't have to. The host nodded as if understanding something unspoken. The mic blinked red. The segment faded to a close. Outside the window, coal dust still clung to the morning air. Inside, JD's voice lingered, not as a headline, not as a takedown, but as a man speaking with weight, not volume. The office was modest. No towering shelves or polished memorabilia, just a desk near the window and a leather chair that creaked with age. The light slanted in through Venetian blinds, casting long, clean lines across the floor. There were no trophies, no honorary diplomas, no photographs of handshakes with presidents. Just one frame on the wall behind the desk. It held a printed email, creased once at the fold, printed in black and white, simple and unembellished. It wasn't blown up or highlighted for emphasis. Just the plain truth, as it had been read aloud on that night. Beneath it, fastened with brass screws, sat a rectangular plaque. The words etched into its surface were short, but they struck deeper than speeches. Don't raise your voice. Raise your proof. JD had stood in front of that frame the morning it was mounted. Alone. No press, no advisors, no staffers hovering with cameras. Just him and the silent weight of what it meant to hang that moment. Not to boast, but to remember. He hadn't framed it for applause or legacy. He'd done it so the next young intern walking into that office, the next Coal Town mayor sitting across from him, or the next skeptic who thought Washington was too slick for sincerity, could see that proof still mattered, that not every truth needed to scream to be heard. Outside the office, life moved on. Polls shifted, headlines changed, alliances bent with the wind. But in this quiet space, one truth remained, framed not for vengeance but for vigilance. And as the late afternoon sun dipped low, catching the edge of the plaque in a soft golden hue, the silence felt heavier than any applause ever could. The microphone didn't break her. The truth did. This story reminds us that in a world full of noise, it is quiet conviction and not volume that carries the greatest weight. JD didn't win by shouting louder. He stood his ground with proof, purpose, and the memory of those who couldn't speak for themselves. It wasn't about silencing an opponent. It was about amplifying a forgotten truth. The moment teaches us that real leadership isn't flashy. It's steady, uncomfortable, and deeply human. What about you? Have you ever witnessed someone stand up, not with anger, but with quiet strength, and change the conversation for good? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.